Good. Okay. Hi, everyone again. Good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf. I'm the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center, and it's a pleasure to welcome many of you back here from yesterday and some new faces today, some from Seattle. Hello, in the back of the room. It's wonderful to be here again. Professor Gates is here, as you know, so we are ready to go today to hear Daniel Padilla Peralta's second lecture in his W.E.B. Du Bois lecture series, Classicism and Other Phobias, and today's installment is Zealots. As we did yesterday, we're also streaming today's lecture on Zoom. Hello, Zoom audience. And we encourage questions from both our Thompson Room audience and our Zoom audience. A couple of questions came in yesterday on Zoom that we didn't get to, but Professor Padilla will be addressing those questions today and tomorrow. For those of you on Zoom, please put your question in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. And for those of you in this room, just raise your hands and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible in as fair and equitable a manner as possible. Right now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Naomi Weiss, with whom we were fortunate to work earlier this semester on the event that I mentioned yesterday called Uprooting Medea. Professor Weiss is the Gardner-Cowles Associate Fellow of the Humanities at Harvard. She's been at Harvard since 2014 after receiving a BA and master's from Oxford and a PhD in classics from the University of California at Berkeley. Much of her research has focused on performance and representation of music and dance in archaic and classical Greece, particularly in tragedy, on which she has published multiple articles. She's the author of The Music of Tragedy, Performance and Imagination in Euripidean Theater, and the co-editor of Genre in Archaic and Classical Greek Poetry, Theories and Models, and Music and Memory in the Ancient Greek and Roman Worlds. Her new project is called Seeing Theater, the Phenomenologies of Ancient Greek Drama, and it examines how ancient Greek theater shapes its audience as viewers, how tragedy, comedy, and satyr construct the phenomenological experience of their audiences and how this experience is restaged and appropriated in other media. She has also very patiently explained to me what reception theory is, which I appreciate. Please give a warm Hutchins Center welcome to Professor Naomi Weiss. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It doesn't seem right for me to have an introduction like that when we're all here for Professor Padilla. It is a real honor today to introduce Daniel Padilla Peralta for the second of his 3 W.E.B. Du Bois lectures here at Harvard. We heard some of his illustrious career from my colleague David Elmer yesterday, and forgive me, I'm going to repeat some of that now. Professor Padilla is Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton University. He's also affiliated there with programs in Latino Studies and in Latin American Studies, and with the University Center for Human Values. He earned his BA at Princeton, where he was the Latin salutatorian and recipient of the Daniel M. Sachs Class of 1960 Graduating Scholarship for the class of 2006. As a Sachs Scholar, he earned a second bachelor's degree at the University of Oxford, where I first met him in classics, or literae humaniores, as it's called there. Then he moved to California, completing his PhD at Stanford in 2014. After 2 years in Columbia's Society of Fellows, he returned to Princeton as faculty. In addition to teaching at Princeton and giving lectures all around the country, he's off next week to deliver the Distinguished Lecture in the Humanities at the University of Southern California. He participates, as he mentioned in yesterday's Q&A, in the Freedom and Citizenship Program run by Columbia University for New York City high school students. Professor Padilla's work spans a really impressive range of subjects, forms, and venues. His prize-winning memoir, Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, was published in 2015 with Penguin Random House. It's a brilliant and important book. His other book, Divine Institutions, Religions and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, came out with Princeton University Press in 2020. In it, Professor Padilla shows the central role of religious ritual and observance in the transformation of Rome from an Italian city-state to a Mediterranean superpower. He has co-edited Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation, which came out in 2017. He's co-authoring a study of 338 BCE and the origins of Roman imperialism, which is under contract with Harvard University Press. He's also writing a People's History of Rome. This book, under contract with Princeton, promises to tell the story of the ancient Roman world, I quote, from the ground up, by reconstructing worlds of non-elite and subjugated peoples whose stories have generally been excluded from the grand narratives of Rome's empire. If he doesn't already sound busy enough, know that he's also co-editing a volume on new approaches to the Middle Roman Republic and co-authoring a book-length essay on race and racism in the disciplinary identity of the field of classics. As we saw yesterday, he also works on the receptions and constructions of the classical world, including in the Black Atlantic. As Professor Padilla says on his Princeton webpage, he is, I quote, a staunch believer in the importance of public scholarship. He served on the editorial board of the public-facing classics journal Eidolon, for which he wrote pieces on, for example, the relationship between classics, hip-hop, and immigration. His work has also appeared in Newsweek, The Guardian, Matter, and Vox. What that overview of Professor Padilla's work maybe doesn't fully convey is the impact his voice has had on the field of classics. He has been at the forefront of a push, a necessary, vital push for change in this age-old discipline, a discipline that has a long history of fostering and perpetuating structural inequalities. We have a long way to go in terms of confronting that past and reshaping classics as it now stands, and also in terms of rethinking classicism, that is, to draw from Professor Padilla's words yesterday, a normative system of presumed value. Such presumed value still underlies much of the humanities in the modern day university. The question at stake is none other, as he put it, what a defensible humanities might be and do. In his lecture here yesterday, Professor Padilla presented us with one powerful mode of inquiry or resistance to counter the undertow of disciplinary attachments, the classicism of feudativity and insurgence. He gave us as a case study of reading otherwise through the lens of, or with attention to feudativity, by talking about Juan de Castellano's epic poem, Elegías de Varones Ilustres de Indias. He promised that today, with a lecture entitled Zealots, he will, among other things, tell us a story. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Padilla.
Well, I start by reincorporating my expressions of gratitude yesterday and thanking Naomi today for the introduction, which has done something very important. By recapitulating yesterday's lecture, it has spared me the task of doing it. So I can now proceed directly to today's lecture. I'm so grateful to all of you who have come out and all of you who are joining us over Zoom. And I look forward to our conversation after the talk. So the title for today's lecture holds a key to different moments in my life. It is a call out in the first instance to the Zealots.
1, 2, I'm about to set this off like this. Hip hoppers, check it. Another MC loses life tonight, Lord. I beg that you pray to Jesus Christ. Why? Oh Lord, Father, don't let him bury me. Whoa. I horn MCs like Mephistopheles, bringing swords to Damocles. Secret Service keep a close watch as if my name was Kennedy.
You can listen to the rest after the talk. But this is a song from the 1996 Fugees record, the score that wrapped a boy on the cusp of adolescence in its bravado. It fired up an obsession with the artistry of Lauryn Hill, and as a virtuoso creation of the Haitian diaspora, also initiated for me the lifelong work of addressing myself to the insular estrangements of Haitians and Dominicans, estrangements that, as Loria Garcia Peña has taught us, derive from and inscribe into Hispaniola the hegemonic geopolitics of white supremacy. The title of today's talk is also a call out to insurgency and resistance in a different note. The Zealots of the 1st century CE, whose motivations and actions are misrepresented in the writings of the Jewish historian turned Roman sympathizer Josephus, in an important text for my later training as a Roman historian and historian of ancient Roman and Mediterranean religions. Somewhere in the middle of these sites of formation, these space times of formation, are floating scraps of immigrant, diasporic, and academic life that defy any effort to impose coherence. Sunday afternoons at St. Anthony of Padua Church in the Bronx, at the Centro Católico Carismático, watching Dominicans ride in the possession of the Spirit, a gift of the late 1990s. Weekday and weekend rehearsals as a table escort for the first and only debutante ball I ever attended. Young, gifted, in Black, always humming in the background. Another gift of the late 1990s. And those evenings and nights of communion with Los Santos in the family seances and spirit possessions that, not fully comprehensible to me, in fact resisted by me, glimmered with other worlds and elsewheres of Afro-diasporic religions. This was a third gift of the late 1990s, and it's one about which I'll say more in a few minutes. But first I start with an episode from a few years ago. In September of 2018, I traveled to the University of Kansas to give a talk on classics as a form of racial knowing. This talk was key to a passage from Achille Mbembe's critique of Black reason that seemed to me brimming with possibilities for theorizing the epistemic properties of the field as discipline. Though I worried in preparing the talk, and had confirmed for me by the talk's reception, that the contents of my talk might be banalized by the audience to the message, classics needs to be more inclusive. Well, yes, but inclusive of what and of whom? Here is the passage. The noun Black, we read, has served three functions in modernity, those of summoning, internalization, and reversal. It first designated not human beings like all others, but rather a distinct humanity, one whose very humanity was, and still is, in question. It designated a particular kind of human, those who, because of their physical appearance, their habits and customs, and their ways of being in the world, seem to represent difference in its raw manifestation, somatic, affective, aesthetic, imaginary. The so-called Blacks appeared subsequently as individuals who, because of the fact of their ontological difference, represented a caricature of the principle of exteriority, as opposed to the principle of inclusion. It therefore became very difficult to imagine that they were once like us, that they were once of us. And precisely because they were not either like us or of us, the only link that could unite us is paradoxically the link of separation. Constituting a world apart, the part apart, Blacks cannot become full subjects in the life of our community. Placed apart, put to the side, piece by piece. That is how Blacks came to signify, in their essence and before all speech, the injunction. This passage returned to me unbidden a few months later in the immediate aftermath of a panel at the annual meeting of the Society for Classical Studies. At the time of the Kansas lecture, though, I was mostly preoccupied with gauging the relevance of this passage for the dreaming up of new post-disciplinary futures. The passage had helped me find words for a lingering but previously pre-verbal unease with Black classicism as a concept and as an umbrella term. This phrase seemed to take as given a core of classicism in which Blackness did not itself already reside, hence the need for the adjective. And on being appended to classicism, the adjective executes precisely that task outlined by Mbembe, of marking out difference in its raw manifestation. In the first instance, different from a presumed whiteness, the default setting for classicism. And in the second instance, peripherality to that whiteness, standing on the outside and looking in. Understood along these lines, classicism in its historically overrepresented form was one of those liberal humanistic mechanisms for abstracting a notionally free, partly because deracialized subject, above and away from the preoccupations and crises of racialization. The term Black classicism would therefore, on this reading, bring this work of abstraction into high relief. Blackness is held to enter classicism from the outside, never considered a formation internal to its operations, even though its operations regularly script various forms of racialization. On that trip to Kansas, I was also grieving my father, who had passed away that summer in Santo Domingo. It would be another month and a half before I traveled back to Santo Domingo to pick up several boxes of his belongings, discovering in one of them a copy of César Nicolás Pinzón's Cosas Añejas. Originally published in 1891, this collection of semi-fictionalized relatos of Dominican history and Dominican mythography had seemed to me ripe for a classical reception study ever since Gloria Garcia Peña unlocked its commingling of explicit anti-Haitianism and anti-Blackness with the weaponization of ancient myth in a marvelous discussion in the borders of Dominicanidad. It would startle me to encounter my father's worn copy of Cosas Añejas, and I would wonder how he'd squared the book and his own intellectual formation in the ambient anti-Haitianism of Trujillo's dictatorship and its sequelae with the humanitarian work to which he had contributed in the aftermath of the 2010 earthquake. But all of that came later. After discharging the responsibilities for which I'd been flown to Lawrenceville, I spent a few hours at the Spencer Art Museum, which was then holding an exhibition of the Haitian American artist Ulrich Jean-Pierre, The Ties That Bind, Haiti, the United States, and the art of the Bois Caïman gathering of 1791. Standing in front of Jean-Pierre's depiction of this episode, I began to play with alternatives to classicism that might take this ceremony as their point of departure. The moment when the overrepresentation of white enslaver power in all its economic, political, and cultural manifestations shows itself not only as precarious, but as capable of being overcome. At Bois Caïman, where enslaved Africans from multiple plantations meet to lay the groundwork for rebellion, the proceedings are capped with the sacrifice of a black pig to the Loa Etzili Dantor. Michel Roth-Trouillot's arresting description of the event in Stirring the Pot of Haitian History, newly republished in an excellent translation from Creole, can be put to work not merely as a factual report, but as an authorizing text for a different brand of classicism. When Saint Louis slaves were scheming their attack, Trouillot writes, they needed an organization. They drew on the only kind of organizations they knew of, voodoo organizations. People badmouth Bois Caïman in two ways. They say it was just a political gathering. They say it was just a mystical ceremony. Whether they take it seriously or whether they take it for mumbo jumbo, they don't take it for what it was. Four things happened at Bois Caïman. A mambo voodoo priestess killed a pig. The rebels drank the pig's blood. The rebels swore they wouldn't betray the cause. They decided how they would attack. People who study the religion of the Homian spirits encounter a similar ceremony in Africa, killing pigs, drinking pig's blood, oath-taking. That ceremony has three meanings: solidarity, trust, and secrecy. That ceremony means all initiates stand strong together, all initiates believe in one another, and all initiates would rather die than speak the secret. Therefore, it wasn't a political gathering, which would mean wasting time speaking French and competing against one another. What happened was political, but it wasn't only political. In any case, it wasn't the same type of politics known to most European people. But the slaves weren't messing around either, and they weren't cracking jokes. It was a voodoo ceremony that was simultaneously the most important political oath they could mutually take before they decided to turn Saint-Domingue upside down. Attending to Trouillot's description does three things. First, and obviously, it entails attention to the words of a Haitian historian and anthropologist about this epochal event in hemispheric and global history, words that puncture those interpretations of Bois Caïman that merely exoticize what occurred there, or that configure and refigure the episode's meanings by triangulation to historical events of the European Enlightenment that are regularly invested with greater authority. Second, it marks a commitment to, or at the very least, a recognition of the urgencies of a reparative historiography, since both the original publication of Stirring the Pot of Haitian History and its translation into English were intended as reparative counters within a landscape of knowledge production about the Caribbean that to this day remains dominated by mostly white academics trained at predominantly white Euro-American institutions. And finally, it holds the door open to the prospect of another classicism whose universalizing enterprise would ground itself in the spirits of Black liberation. The spirits matter. They matter partly because the story of the classics that has overrepresented itself as the only classicism has secularism as its center and a corresponding antagonism towards anything that smacks of organized religion or theology. Not that this has prevented this species of classicism from donning the apparel of piety or engaging in devotional practices, as Nietzsche snappily remarked in a witticism that's almost too good an epigraph for the lead chapter of Catherine Conybeare and Simon Goldhill's edited volume on classical philology and theology, quote, "I am afraid we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar," end quote. But these spirits of Bois also matter because the machinery of the European Enlightenment and its predecessor intellectual formations trains its sights on invalidating their relation to the work of rationally pursued and strategically crafted collective action, largely by holding the spirits to be inimical to, at the very best, the shadowy underside of the collective's attainment of reason. It was the worship of spirits that in the generations before and after Sepúlveda and Las Casas, face off at Valladolid, become instrumentalized as a sign of otherness as a foundational principle of the European division of the world into pagan and non-pagan orders. And this cartography of faith and spirit has much to do, in fact, almost everything to do, with the escalating refinement of Greco-Roman classics' capacity to overrepresent itself. The Western European effort to apprehend and circumscribe the spirits of Native American communities and of the Afro-Atlantic diasporas within prisons of linguistic and metaphysical control would have been inconceivable without it. This effort, which gives rise to the classifications of fetish and witchcraft at the center of recent work by Benjamin Breen and Cécile Froment, among others, is one component of the larger project of pasting Afro-diasporic and indigenous peoples, a project that takes off in the 1500s. The rediscoveries, or better, reactivations of the cultures and histories of ancient Greece and Rome, in dialogue with the construction of primitivizing schemes that, as these seek to justify anti-Black and anti-indigenous violence, and indeed discursively generate and reproduce the Black and Native as quintessential others, script them as akin to the pagans of the past. What the male European elites needed in that world, considered to have been given to them, Vince Wimbush observes in a chapter of White Men's Magic that does heavy lifting to push past the Eurocentrism of Tony Grafton's New World's Ancient Texts, among other works, quote, was a conceptual hook by which the savages could be understood, assimilated, and controlled. More specifically, it meant engagement in a tendentious, obfuscating, even violent cultural politics of comparison, making exotics read like the pagans of Europeans' constructed Greco-Roman Christian antiquity that somehow mirrored modern European forms of Christianity. So the savages understood, interpreted, assimilated, domesticated as the pagans of antiquity, were placed within, but on the periphery of European worlds. This was a particular form of dominance. In this way, the savages could be accounted for in European mythic histories and collective psyches. The others were inscripted, brought into the European cultural circle, into the pan-European semiosphere. This inscription preserved the mythic past and ongoing myth-making through making creative uses of the text of center formation. But nuance is very important here. The exoticism of the discovered peoples with this creative reading on the part of the European elites was done in order to integrate them not so much into European society, but rather into the European mind. That is, this reading was intended not so much to fit the others in, but to explain them, end quote. As Wimbush goes on to explain, the labor of explanation is directed at the resolution of an epistemic crisis. In the intellectual ferments of the 16th and 17th centuries, the appeal of pagan as a classification for African and New World indigenous peoples derives not only from the affordance it provides to those humanists who wanted to apparel themselves in the rhetorical and material bellicosity of patristic antecedents, but in its capacity, and I quote Wimbush again, to explain and legitimize the present in which the new peoples were discovered, end quote, through the fabrication of a past for them. And their pastness was one cornerstone of the difference that was cited to justify and intensify their exploitation. The spirits matter because they guide the revolutionary undertaking that commences with Bois. And here it is important to stress with Trouillot the centrality of the spirits, not only to the ritual surrounding and cementing the plotting, but to the intellectual architecture of the Haitian Revolution as a collective act. In those historiographical works that have recovered the Haitian Revolution as a decisive moment in the constitution of global modernity, I'm thinking in particular of C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, the emphasis is often on how the revolution and its movers and shakers align themselves with or realize through their actions those political philosophical commitments that are normally attributed to the European Enlightenment. Key to the articulation of this rapport between the eminences of the revolution and the intellectual worlds of the European Enlightenment is to turn to ancient Greece and Rome for the language and vocabulary of exemplary deeds. The practice attaches most regularly to the life of Toussaint Louverture, the Black Spartacus, an interest in classicizing him already prefigured in a 1934 play, The Black Jacobins organizes its emplotment of the leader and the Haitian Revolution around narrative devices with detectable Greco-Roman pedigrees. And it's not out of the question, as Lydia Langerwerf speculated in 2011, that his assessment of the dilemmas of revolution and specifically, quote, the problem of ruling while and after revolting, end quote, drew its bearings from ancient narratives of slave revolts. But neither the life of Toussaint nor the Haitian Revolution as a whole is reducible to the mobilization of Greco-Roman antiquity as a device for classicizing them, obviously. And the limitation of readings, however sensitive, that have probed this connection is that even the move to bring out the generativity of this one antiquity for anti-colonial designs risks, and here I quote Soudire as Razine's Black Spartacus, The Epic Life of Louverture, downplaying the breathtaking originality of Toussaint and his comrades. Some of that originality arises from the spirit worlds of the revolution, which do not square well with the tropes and emplotments typical of that form of the classical that had already succeeded in overrepresenting itself. In the service of exposing this misfit, this necessarily imperfect non-alignment, here is a story from the late 1990s. The deeper dive into autobiography that this story will kick off may not resonate with everyone's sense of what is congenial to or best suited for the ventures of revisioning classicism. My colleague Barbara Graziosi has, in a newly published essay on classics and the limits of the autobiography, that's the title, piloted with the aid of João Guimarães Rosa's line, "A book is sometimes greater than a man," to the position that, quote, the denial of affective stances rooted in love and pleasure, and therefore also vulnerability and weakness, end quote, mark the current boundaries of autobiographical interventions in classics. In counterpoint, I'll be presenting some scenes from the Caribbean diaspora that bring out the complexity of affects that converge around one life as it meditates on its own past and present disciplinarization. Mindful always to defang the reproach advanced by Graziosi by demonstrating that, and here I'll inhabit Cornell West for a moment, there's a lot of love in that funk. But the second objective of the autobiographical reader is to overrepresent these scenes from the Caribbean diaspora and to invest them through my own investiture with authority as a Du Bois lecturer, with the capacity to command the attention of folks who customarily traverse predominantly white institutional spaces. It is to the task of overrepresenting myself in order to carry on and through the memories and values of this diaspora that I am willing to stake a great deal. As 50 Cent says, because it's me you see on your TV. The late 90s were years of listening to the Fugees, sure, but they were also the years of plowing through Will and Ariel Durant's 11-volume The Story of Civilization, and thanks to a precipitation into New York City private schooling, being formed and forming myself in the image of Willie Jennings's man builder, a concept I introduced and discussed yesterday, drawn ineluctably into repeat performances of isolating self-sufficiency. I wanted to devour grand-sounding books about free will and determinism and then write grand-sounding papers about free will and determinism, quoting the same European philosophers over and over again. I wanted to show off my skill at reproducing Latin and ancient Greek forms, especially in front of those classmates and teachers whom I suspected of under or misestimating me. And I wanted to bask forever and forever in the warm glow of report card comments that I was the pater familias of my class. True story, I had a teacher write that. It was still some time before I would encounter Du Bois in chapter 1 of Souls of Black Folk, quote, "That sky was bluest when I could beat my mates at examination time or beat them at a foot race or even beat their stringy heads," end quote. But before I read those words, I was living them, and nothing quickened the pulse or set me vibrating more than the desire to vault right over my peers. Like Suetonius's Julius Caesar, I wanted to jump right on top of their heads. Insultatorum omnibus capitibus. And it was no deterrent to face up to their derision, which after all was only another language to master. I had the ambition to devour anything and everything that presented itself as invested with canonizing authority, and nothing would stop me. But it was the narrow canon, the one held up to me as an authoritatively singular one, when in point of fact, it was one of many that held my attention and guided my steps. How I unlearned this, how I found kinship and strength in the move away from this contingent form of mastery and towards Julieta Singh's vision for unthinking mastery is a story for another day. What matters for now is that into this fantasy world of self-realization, stoked and goaded by a schooling that preached to me that William Ernest Henley gospel of being the master of my fate and the captain of my soul, there stepped the spirits, Los Santos. When my mother, brother, and I were living on pre-gentrification Bradhurst Avenue in Central Harlem, here is a slide that shows pre-gentrification Bradhurst and post-gentrification Bradhurst. Another Dominican family moved in with us, Esteban and his spouse Olga, along with their 5 children. So it came to pass that our 2-bedroom apartment, rent mostly paid for by a housing voucher, stretched to hold 10 people. Esteban, Olga, and their children moved into the bedroom that my brother and I had previously shared. He and I slept in my mother's bedroom and did our homework in the living room. I felt pressed, real pressed, that Esteban was taking advantage of my mother's generosity, her willingness to open the doors to anyone who needed a place to stay. I was already devising a hard self in opposition to what I perceived as the softness, the malleability of her disposition towards others. Where she was too open and kind, I would be closed off and harsh. And here, I'll summon a story from early on in the pandemic. I was reshelving some books that had survived the multi-decade journey from our old apartment to my house. And I came across my first copy of Richmond Lattimore's translation of the Iliad, which I had got my hands on during this period. And I found on the flyleaf the address of a funeral home in the South Bronx. The notation teleported me to the wake for the teenage son of one of my mother's friends who had been gunned down in our neighborhood. And it also teleported me to the memory of how I had sat impassively the entire wake, tight-lipped and everything, not a feeling for show, and how in response to my mother's earnest questioning about my mood, responded that everything was fine. Además, esto no me importa. It was that time of my life that was most obsessed with fronting. It didn't help that one of Esteban and Olga's 5 children was about my age. I burned to compete with him, and then I sought out times and spaces to outclass him. At school, I was already in the fancy private school. He was in public school. I got A's, he didn't. On the basketball courts, 2 blocks from our apartment building. Other kids in the neighborhood might have been beating my ass relentlessly on the courts, but I repaid that kindness by hounding him. On the racetrack, you name it. Beef was when I saw him. But the real beef came with something else that Esteban brought into our lives. Esteban communicated with spirits. I was under very strict instructions that in company, I was not to refer to him as a santero or as his engaging in anything that involved voodoo or anything like that. But every other week, Esteban opened up a channel to communicate with El Muerto, the dead one. Mom was very sold on Esteban's abilities. Late afternoon or early evening of the appointed day, Esteban walked into one of our 2 bedrooms and sat down in a corner, usually with a glass of liquor or wine. He would bow his head and close his eyes in perfect stillness for what felt like an eternity, before his body spasmed in a frenzy, eyes rolling up, arms and legs flailing, and then the calm would return and speech in the spirit, at which point Olga and my mother would round up the children of the household and lead us right to him. The bedroom lights were turned off, the candle was lit. We took seats in a circle and were greeted by the voice of El Muerto. At the time, I was living this diasporic drama of bicamerality and cultural collision that I couldn't quite fully apprehend in those terms. On the one hand, the competitive man builder at a predominantly white school had some space in head and heart for the Dominican diasporic superstar, Quinito Mendes. And for an entire archive of music that drew its iridescent gleam from the Afro-diasporic religions of Hispaniola and the Greater Caribbean. When Quinito, sampling Enerolisa Núñez, opened Suero de Amor as follows. Yo soy un mareño, y vengo de los olivos, a darle la mano de fuego, y a levantar los caídos. Ay, yo soy Agú, mareño, y vengo de allá, mareño, Ana Isabel, mareño, y Papa Bocos, mareño, Ogún Belie, mareño, Ogún Bacán, mareño. Ay, Papa Septimos. watch the rest on YouTube. I understood on some abstract level, whenever I heard this song, whenever I heard other songs steeped in the same tradition, that this was Esteban's world and that it was my world. I danced to this music every time it played, wherever it played. These were the divinities of the Afro diaspora, the cosmos of Los Muertos. But in conversations with my mother, I was incredibly dismissive of Esteban's practice. Yo no creo en eso, I don't believe in that. With all my necio questions, who was this muerto exactly? Why were we listening to him? El muerto usually dispensed advice, barbed with criticism. Coge consejo. And there was plenty of it. For Esteban and Olga's children, the advice consisted mostly of reminders to behave better, be more attentive in school. For my mother, the spirit steered a project on which she was apparently collaborating with Esteban, but that I'd heard nothing about outside of these sessions, the funding and construction of an orphanage in Santo Domingo. This was typical mom. We were broke as hell, but somehow she was finding dólares to send to Santo Domingo to support this orphanage. Now, many years later, when my father / her estranged spouse did a little digging to find out whether Esteban had actually filed the paperwork for the orphanage, it was revealed that Esteban had been running a long con on my mother, but that's another story. Or is it? For me, El Muerto was all predictable monotony. At first, you need to be more respectful, stop arguing with your mother. What God gave you, God will take away. Now, like any machito de hombre who was reared in Caribbean patriarchy, just like any creature of the Dominican diaspora's bárbaro y tigre stylings, I acted like I was absolutely always right. I simply could not be bothered with any of this guidance. And also, I thought the facts bore me out. I didn't need to listen to any of this. Yes, I was argumentative with my mom, but it's not like I was defying her dreams for us. I wasn't, as I would say to her, I wasn't slinging rocks or anything like that. All I wanted was to wear my jeans low, listen to some rap music, and hang out with my friends after doing my homework. It was a big deal. And I was getting good grades at school. Was this not mom's immigrant dream? Instead, I had to put up with some fake muerto speaking down to me on the regular. But here was the rub. I had no one I felt comfortable talking about this with. The one time I had the audacity to say to mom that these sessions really pissed me off, me encojonaban, well, that was a mistake. That was a real mistake. I was too busy stunning in front of my friend groups to grant even a sliver of space to any conversation about El Muerto and Los Santos. And telling the white boys at my private school was entirely out of the question because they already exoticized me enough. First boredom, then resignation crept over me as the sessions became a permanent part of our family life. But then there was the night when El Muerto had strong words for Esteban and Olga's teenage son, and Ricky didn't take them quietly. Olga implored him to shut up and have some respect, and then, well, El Muerto sipped from the cup in his hand and spat right in Ricky's face. I froze. Ricky folded into a corner and began sobbing. Later, I told myself, if he ever comes at me like that, I will swing. But that was blustering self-talk. I knew I wasn't actually going to swing. The shock was enough to keep me on my toes. Fast on the heels of worrying anticipation came another surprise. At one of the sessions, El Muerto, who seemed to have abilities of apprehension that did exceed mine, revealed knowledge of my newest hobby. The hobby that my friends and I talked about all the time, the hobby that marked our awakening into a different phase of our sexual expression as teenagers. How did El Muerto know about this hobby? Did he really have powers like that? I thought I was so stealthy, but he knew, and he knew when to wield that knowledge to embarrass me in front of everyone. He said it right in the circle, and as I cried in anger at the revelation, and then in anger at my scared little self for crying, my anger at the Muerto became almost galactic in proportions. The visits with El Muerto continued even after Esteban and Olga moved out a year later. We just had to travel to the Bronx for these visits. I couldn't let go of the shame that trailed the memory of the Muerto's revelation, still less the anger that flared whenever the lights went dim and everyone crammed into a bedroom corner. But my original skepticism in El Muerto and Los Santos began to yield to something like a grudging recognition of their force. Esteban, the person I could not respect, especially not after some of his hustling ways came to light. But El Muerto and Los Santos, though, they seemed intriguing. El Muerto is special. How was I to make better sense of them? My, by turns, oppositional and conciliatory relation to them, and their power over me and mine. I couldn't quite let go of one thing that El Muerto had announced at one of our very first sessions, that whatever we achieved as a family, it was always under the protection of Los Santos. They were our stewards on the diasporic journey from Santo Domingo to New York City and beyond. Whenever my mind turns to the spirits these days, I think of El Muerto, materializing in our dusty-ass apartments as I cross the threshold of adolescence, holding us in rapt attention for the hours that he crossed from his world to ours. The physical memory of boredom and of legs cramping from sitting awkwardly rises right to the surface, as did the shame and anger of that moment of disclosure. But I can also see through the mist of recollection how emboldened and empowered my mother was by contact with El Muerto, how the connection gave her a will and a drive to persevere, how it anchored her in that universe of childhood and adolescent encounters with Los Santos that had been her life on the northern shore of the Dominican Republic before she left for college in the capital, and the series of serendipitous events that culminated with a husband and children. In time, I would understand that this universe, drawing on many centuries of indigenous and Afro-diasporic entanglements in Hispaniola and the Greater Caribbean, required resources to be appreciated and studied. It was a cultural system endowed with unique and resonant potencies, any one of which could occupy a lifetime of practice and scholarship. And little by little, I also began to discern that my intellectual formation within a certain tradition of humanistic inquiry, the one that had overrepresented itself as a primary mode of classicism, had left me rather ill-equipped to pursue the kinds of practice and scholarship that would open up meditation on Los Santos and El Muerto. I joke sometimes to colleagues and students that in another life, and possibly even this one, I will just retrain as a Caribbeanist. But the joke conceals a more complicated package of emotions than regret and its kin. There's something of José Esteban Muñoz's disidentification, certainly, but also packaged in the assembly of affect is the apprehension that Los Santos are not legible to the Greco-Roman classics as classical, that these spirits have had to bargain hard for their admission into formations of authoritative classicism because, at least within the matrix of the liberal humanities, in their Euro-American instantiation, the rituals of the Black Atlantic have not until recently been points of disciplinary departure or hermeneutic inquiry. Their world historical force was not textualized for me to absorb as authoritative, certainly not in those school settings with a tyranny not merely of the book, but of the book as a device of white norming power held sway. This is why I chuckle sometimes at tweets like these, the one that is enclosed in blue on this slide. Tweets that credit my upward mobility to great books education and characterize critique issuing forth from my subject position as a grift. I'll have more to say about that tomorrow. Sure, my friend, but what was the price of the ticket? Do you know? It's not only that my training in Greco-Roman classics from an early age didn't furnish me with a language for the study of Los Santos and the universe that I shared with them, it obscured for me their own web of cosmic relations, their own spinning of classicizing threads. There has been and continues to be expert literary and visual artistic work that unites the worlds of Greek and Roman myth with the cosmogonies and cosmologies of the African diaspora. It's salutary and edifying to engage with the paintings of the Afro-Cuban artist Monia Rosales as a supremely gifted exponent of this intercultural mediation. In connection with study and reflection on Rosales' work, I've been worrying and parsing over the writings of another artist from the Caribbean diaspora, Chiara Alegria Judes. Here is Judes in her memoir, My Broken Language, tapping some of the pride and excitement that surged during her earliest moments of playwriting, and her resistance to the assimilation of her work and the universes encompassed in her work into a paradigm of that one overrepresented classicism. Mom's spirit world filled every page. My work dripped with Los Santos. Yemaya entered stage left. Lights rose on Oshun, which will see the herbalist lurk behind a garden snake. Sometimes the Orisha were main characters front and center. Other times they went unnamed, my secret code behind the story. One play had mostly conventional scenes that I interrupted midway for intentionally awkward rituals, sensual, silent moments. In these rituals, an actor moved her body in embarrassing ways when words became insufficient. A ritual to mourn a wife lost to fire. A ritual for boys for sexual arousal. Invented ceremonies, the stuff of dreams. But all mom's cleanings and ebos and possessions lurked between the lines, gave me a physical vocabulary to put on stage. Magic realism, a dramaturg said. The label irked me. Your Greek and Roman gods, my classmates said. Your Romulus and Remus, your Echo and Narcissus. The comparison annoyed me. Sensual is different than magical, I thought. The Greeks were then, I thought. The Orisha are now. Comparison of the sort that came immediately, one might even say reflexively, to Ulysses' classmates is a seemingly ubiquitous feature of responses to the work of Afro-diasporic artists who play with those iconographic signifiers that are ascribed or sourced to Greco-Roman classicism. Notice how she responds to the comparisons. She dispatches the association with magic realism by stressing the gap between magical and sensual by not allowing the latter to be overwritten into or subsumed by the former. But next comes the decisive maneuver, the counter to that attempt to claim her creative world as simply another expression of Greco-Roman classicism. The Greeks were then, the Orisha are now. I vibe to this clear-voiced affirmation of temporal distance and priority, even as I strain to grasp its enigmatic many-sidedness. The statement has a relativizing aspect to it, perhaps. From Ulysses' position, the Orisha are alive and pulsing. They are hers now, whereas the Greek and Roman gods exist as possessions of the past. But would it follow, and would she be all too happy or reluctant to concede, that the classmates for whom this comparison renders her work legible inhabit a space-time in which the Greeks exist now, but only for them? Or is her remark intended to deny any claim to presentness that the Greeks may have for her classmates in the first instance, but presumably for other readers and interlocutors of her work with similar epistemic formations? I'm about that now. But it is an obligation shared by all of us to examine intently the fabric of this now. It's typical of some classicists who are seeking to position either themselves or the overrepresented version of classicism in which they practice above the fray to assert that the brawls and struggles of yesteryear and the histories and legacies that attach to the overrepresentation of classicism do not or should not have any purchase on this contemporary moment or on the futures that we see from this contemporary moment. One of the more startling recent examples of this tendency appears in Eric Adler's chapter on Martin Bernal and Black Athena in Classics, the Culture Wars and Beyond, which came out in 2016. Seeking to explain the near silence that greeted the publication of Bernal's third volume, Adler holds that by 2006, quote, the culture wars were over. The scandal attached to Black Athena revolved around culture wars, disputes over the canon, multiculturalism, and especially Black studies. Although these remain contested topics, the attacks of 9/11 forced them to the intellectual sidelines, end quote. Denise Bukowski has written sparkingly about the deficits of this type of explanation, which slots the debate over Bernal into a cultural wars framework that is held to be dated, despite its many living and corrosive manifestations, and about the haunting force of Bernal for the field of classics generally. And soon, Sasha May Eccleston's study of 9/11's imprint on the enterprises of racialized authors as these contended with canon, canonicity, and state violence to produce new meanings of the epochal will put to rest any half-baked presumptions about intellectual history on either side of 9/11. For these and other reasons, such as the struggle for the life and futures of Black studies being fought right now as bans on the teaching of race and racism multiply, Adler's explanation to me falls flat. But the more stimulating line to take in response to this species of explanation, if we are primed to think about the forms of fantasy indulged by the discipline's practitioners, as I indicated in the first lecture with reference to the work of Maya Katrositz, is to ask what is the traction as well as the payoff of holding that the cultural wars and its associated convulsions exist in the discipline's past. I should say that even those who have worked and continue to work as allies in the effort to open up the field sometimes indulge this fantasy. Let me quote the opening sentences of an op-ed from my colleague, Barbara Graziosi, Classics Post-Critique, in which a version of this fantasy rises to the surface. It's not my intention, she writes, here to rehearse all the arguments and discussions that have raged in the media over the past few months, except to say that they have, by and large, been backward-looking in orientation, whether in criticizing the behavior of individual classicists or the shortcomings of the field at large. My concern here is the future of the discipline. There are many ways in which classics has been used over the centuries in the service of white supremacy and other forms of oppression and exclusion. What I would like to ask is what follows from this reckoning, in other words, what happens to classics post-critique. This op-ed found me ready and willing to sympathize with its ethical momentum, but not with its account of what has brought the discipline to its moment of reckoning. About the relegation of classics to the status of inert matter, capable only of being use or of utility in its deployment, I'll offer more direct comment in tomorrow's lecture. I part ways with my colleagues' belief that the critique that's modeled or exemplified in recent debates is backward-looking, and with a partner presumption that a move to the future entails moving past critique. But again, whether the representation offered of these debates within and about the field of classical studies is factually correct matters less to me than its ideational and aspirational properties. Readers of Rita Felsky and her many respondents will know that the maneuver to forms of humanistic practice that market themselves as coming after or beyond or superseding critique is never an innocent move. It is, like so many other discipline-shaping behaviors, an ideological move. If we sit with the ideational side of Graziosi's remarks for a moment and peer into its intellectual genealogies a little more carefully, there's also the question of its own performance of classicism. In a talk on the properties of classicism, later published as a forbiddingly long chapter in Classical Past, that left such a deep impression on my undergraduate self that its handout traveled with me on multiple transatlantic and transcontinental moves. Jim Porter mapped classicism's relation to futurity and specifically the content of what he termed prospective or proleptic classicism, anticipation of an envisioned and desired future beholder who will look back on the practitioner's position as classical. Something like this is at work in the turn to thinking with and about the future as the proper staging ground for the resolution of crises currently afflicting this field of classics and adjacent disciplinary formations. But there are two other trouble spots that in that stagger from simplified past to anticipated future that shimmer for me. But for their pinpointing, we will need to leave behind the company of classicists and think instead with those scholars for whom the temporalities of disciplinarity are grounded in the institutionality of racialization. Joseph Young and Jane Evans Breziel hold in their introduction to a superbly curated volume of essays on amnesia in the academy that, contrary to the wish-making of a cohort of very high-profile Afro-diasporic intellectuals, their specific target was Paul Gilroy, who located race in the past so as to stage their knowledge production beyond it. Quote, "The problem of the 21st century is still the problem of the color line, in no small part because of race's role," quote again, "in the construction of humanistic disciplines, specifically their content of study, as well as methods, methodologies, theoretical presuppositions, disciplinary boundaries, the exclusion such boundaries enact, and the inclusions these boundaries are predicated and built upon," end quote. Their edited volume's main virtue is the careful cataloging of the multiple and often dissonant ways that race and racism not only pervade, but in substantive fact, co-produce the Euro-American academic disciplines in this 21st century moment. A side pleasure of the volume lies in the showing up of those scholars whose efforts to, and I'll quote them, "theorize race out of existence," end quote, yields little more than epistemic impoverishment. In lieu of these efforts, one could, with a good deal of justice and for the sake of greater analytical reward, move instead in the direction of what Will Bridges has christened the history of the inhumanities, which locates the original as well as current crisis of the humanities in their constitution around axes and rationales of disqualification, race and racism being preeminent among them. To assign racial violence in the past of the humanities is then at best a travesty of intellectual history, and at worst a grimly unsettle forfeiting of a responsibility of material care to those assaulted by the inhumanities in the here and now. The second trouble spot is similarly prone to materialize at the crossroads of commodification and death. Deborah Bois opens a public books essay on, quote, "how to subvert the capitalist white supremacist university," end quote, with an episode in the life of the 21st century administrators' faux commitments to diversity and inclusion. In a fall 2019 conversation with students, Purdue President Mitch Daniels vouched for his commitment by declaring that the university would, quote, be recruiting one of the rarest creatures in America, a really leading African-American scholar, end quote. Backlash swiftly and deservedly followed. Faculty on the University Senate's Equity and Diversity Committee responded in a statement that, quote, the idea that there's a scarcity of leading African-American scholars is simply not true, end quote. Daniels insisted that he had been misunderstood. Where have we heard this? Citing the accomplishments of his administration in building new pipelines to attract students and faculty from historically minoritized groups. The metaphor of the pipeline and its transparent extractivism in connection with DEI efforts has been much and well exposed in recent years, as has the moral and intellectual perversity of holding up minoritized scholars as a precious resource who are in need first of prospecting, but then of exploitation. But Daniel's remarks had me reminiscing about an incident that had occurred on one of my last trips to Boston a few years ago, for the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature and the American Academy of Religion. At the book exhibit, I ran into a retired historian of ancient Mediterranean religions, a person whose teaching and writing had been exceptionally meaningful for me. We fell into conversation, and when one of his old friends approached, he made the introduction. And this is the time-honored transaction of wielding his social capital to augment mine, the old boys network put to work in the service of my professional advancement. I love it. But these transactions do not come without a cost. And there is always a price to pay for this ticket in the academy that forever minoritizes folks like you. In this case, it was the introduction itself that took its tax. Padilla Peralta, the retired historian, said, "How rare a name in our fields is that?" And with that speech act, I was converted into the rarest of creatures. This pivots from the Daniels episode to a paired reading of Lavelle Porter's The Black Academic Life and Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study, that ends on an optimistic note, and I'll quote, "It is a utopian speculation, but the horizon of possibility that these works trace will keep on inspiring us to congregate in the dingy, forgotten rooms of Black studies, ethnic studies, gender and queer studies departments, and outside the walls of the academy. In those rooms and spaces we steal from the university, we will conspire tirelessly to divest the university from wars, prisons, racial capitalism, and settler colonialism," end quote. But even if in general, there are many more of us within and adjacent to the academy than Daniels was willing to acknowledge, how many of us can actually pursue, let alone realize to the full, these acts of fugitivity? As a coworker in the kingdom recently reminded me when I was busy riffing on Moten and Harney, it's all well and good to be a fugitive at a place like Princeton. But how do you practice fugitivity when your educational institution is being pulverized by state and federal cuts to education funding? For some answers, we might turn not only to the image and example of a Du Bois bringing the pro-archaea to rural Tennessee, on which now we have Withun's new book, but to what Jarvis Givens in a study of Carter G. Woodson has appropriately termed fugitive pedagogy. Yet the fact not of our rareness, but of our rarefication remains, rendering these feats of fugitivity all the more complicated to pull off. We are made rare in these settings because of the killings, the transatlantic killings, the genocides of Manifest Destiny, the unholy alliances of Monroe Doctrine and Jim Crow, the late 20th and early 21st century immigration carceral state, the spirit killings that Jemima Young and Dorothy Hines document and theorize in a luminous 2018 paper. All of these have conspired in the past and in the present to deny consistent and equitable access to the one modality of classicism that has overrepresented itself as classical, and to the representation of other forms of classicism. That overrepresented classicism also consolidates and stages lessons about the viability of other classicisms, the classicisms of the Santos and company, and of other practitioners for those types of classicism in virtually every setting of the Euro-American Academy. How to move against these lessons and elucidate some meaningful and durable alternatives to them will be the focus of tomorrow's lecture. But for now, I thank you and invite your questions.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I assume you
I might have one or two. Thank you. It was great. Could you I know this is not the subject of your lecture, but could you share with us your take on Martin Bernal's work? What was sort of right about it and what was wrong about it? And it's sort of phenomenology, as it were, you know, that it was an intervention at a moment and elicited a response far beyond anything that I think it would today or even years before. I mean, it was the response was timed to a particular context. So, and I've never known, I mean, there was so much, the reaction was so over the top both ways. So I would love to have a classicist respond just about, you know, not with the full lecture, of course, but just the highlights of what was important about his intervention and where was he way off? Or was he right about anything? I'm just curious.
He was right about everything. No, okay. So something that's been intriguing to me recently is that whenever conversations about race and racialization in classics come up, they always circle back to Bernal, but only cite this controversy as if it was sort of the signature controversy. So it's had this long-term effect on the forms of disciplinary history in classics, where this episode and the reactions to it have displaced alternative modes of intellectual history that could actually quite profitably be mined. But to address your question head on, as many folks have said, there is much to take away from Volume 1 in particular. Volume 1 lays out a devastating indictment of the collusion between continental European and specifically German intellectual practice and the development and inscription of classics within discourses of anti-Blackness. And there is some pretty compelling evidence adduced by Bernal in support of the idea that, especially at this decisive moment in the 19th century, the incubation of classics into a standalone discipline is driven in the main by people with frankly racist understandings of the human world, of human knowledge production, and of intellectual history and how to do intellectual history. Volumes 2 and 3 have, from the moment of their publication, come under very heavy fire because of serious inaccuracies in the presentation of linguistic and archaeological evidence. And especially in connection with the second and third volume, the criticism that so much of Bernal's account was derivative and based on outdated scholarship in these two particular fields, right? And there, if one is intent on adjudications of fact, it's hard to buy into Bernal's line. The archaeology does not substantiate many of the claims that he's made, although interestingly enough, there is, I think, a pretty provocative reading of the archaeological record available to us now that would accentuate some of Bernal's supra-interpretations. The issue there, though, as people pointed out, in the context of the early stage reception of Black Athena, is that there were already many folks working in the second half of the 20th century in literary studies, archaeological studies, and historical studies, especially folks with a grounding in ancient Near Eastern cultures who had played up and sought to document the kinds of interactions of interest to Bernal, but from a much more rigorously theorized perspective, right? So this is then the problem of volumes 2 and 3. To a lesser degree, but to an equally consequential outcome, this objection to the form and focus of Bernal's Black Athena also holds some purchase for volume 1. But here I have to sort of tell another story, which is that when I sort of first began grappling with Bernal in earnest, I did so through a very long review of Bernal that was assigned in a seminar I took ages ago. This is a review co-written by Suzanne Marchand and Tony Grafton, where they took particular issue with Bernal as an intellectual historian. And they made this very meticulous case for the inadequacies of Bernal's explanation when it came to the substantive praxis of intellectual history. I found much to object to in that review, not so much because of the sort of main argument, which seemed sort of very well and developed and lavishly documented, but because of how it styled itself. It began by extolling the classicists and in fact the discipline of classics as one characterized by precision and attention to detail, and then sort of made a case that, well, Bernal was not attentive to details. But in doing this, what the review did was to ascribe to classics a sort of quasi-scientific precision that simply restates and reinstantiates a myth of the discipline that emerges in the 19th century context that Bernal had himself attacked. This idea that classics was to be understood as scientific, and that it, because of that scientific property, could develop findings into the cultures of antiquity that could pass some kind of objectivizing criterion, and that correspondingly, those who were best trained to be classicists would be ones who would model this exemplary form of objectivity, right? In doing, in falling into the trap of the reauthorization of that myth, that Marchand and Grafton piece, I think, unwittingly legitimated one of Bernal's arguments, even if Bernal himself had not actually made that argument as explicit as it could have been in volume 1. Right? So that's the brief account of my response.
What was he arguing? We were colleagues at Cornell at the time, and I never read it. I just read the furious response to it. The New York Review of Books, in the Times. You know, the classes lost their minds. But what was, I remember that I was at a dinner with him once and he said, well, my mistake was the title. I shouldn't have called it Black Athena. But what was he arguing, that Athena was black? I mean, what was the argument that he was, not the part about the institutionalization of classics as a discipline, but about the Greeks themselves and their relationship to the Black world? What was the linchpin of his argument?
See, this is, you should read it. The volumes make for great reading. So the argument, to be brutally simplifying about it, is that what we understand to be the distinctive properties and accomplishments of Greek culture are actually derivative from Egyptian and other Near Eastern influences. And that in the case of these Egyptian influences, we can document a trail of migration that is directly responsible for the introduction of these advances that are notionally and normally credited to the Greek world into Greece itself, right? So as part of this argument, and this is where there were real issues.
It's not original.
All right, so
people said that.
Yeah, this is not original, but to make the argument, to make the strong case version of this argument, you need to have this sort of competency in various fields, and you need especially to have a proficiency in the material record. And this is where the volumes stumble, making arguments about the presence of Egyptians, for example, in Greece or Greek context, simply on the basis of specific material artifacts, as folks in classical archaeology had expounded on for long before Bernal, is to engage in a series of presuppositions about the relationship between artifact, people, and the dissemination of ideas associated with those artifacts, right? So it was easy for archaeologists to say, well, your reading of the material culture presupposes something that we've already theorized is not necessarily corresponding to the dissemination of cultures in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. But B, it fundamentally replicates this very dated way of understanding the interaction of materiality with the reproduction and circulation of various forms of knowledge, right? So this was the kind of argument that was made against Bernal that I think had, enormous resonant power. But then there was another set of arguments, and this goes to the heat of the reception of Bernal from the late 1980s on, you mentioned in setting up the question that there's some real attention to context here that is required for engaging with the response to Bernal and its legacies. That the Bernal was working within a hall of mirrors that had been set up by Afrocentrist approaches. Right. And that these approaches had, in many cases, also rested on problematic readings of the material record. So this played out on several different fronts. So as I mentioned earlier, some people would simply zero in on particular registers of evidence and seek to debunk Bernal's claims. Other folks held, and this really gets to the core of the controversy in the 1990s and beyond, that Bernal was, in making these claims, engaging in a travestying and in a sort of perversion of the study of ancient Greece and Rome, and ancient Greece specifically. Some of these responses to Bernal were, I mean, unapologetically racist, right? So that dimension needs to be sort of acknowledged openly. But then there were these other responses that camouflage their racism. And I find these to be sort of more instructive or suggestive. It's these kinds of responses that Denise Mikulski and others have taken up in their response to the response to Bernal, and said, you know, one of the ways in which Bernal's contribution was sort of defanged and neutralized was by simply taking it as a projection or intrusion of Afrocentrism into the study of the ancient world, and saying, well, this ideological superstructure of thought can't apply to this ancient material, therefore we will discard it. And that's it. That's the only conversation we need to have about the many topics that are raised by Bernal, right? One more dimension of this that I should mention is that one of Bernal, among the most striking antagonisms that emerges in and around Bernal's work is Bernal's antagonism with Frank Snowden. And Snowden,
whose nickname at Howard was Apollo.
Apollo.
Frank Snowden's a good Harvard man, by the way.
So Snowden, a good Harvard man, had, over the course of his long career by that point, undertaken these remarkable projects of synthesizing all the available evidence for the Negro and the Ethiopian in the ancient world. This work was under-theorized, and deliberately so. Snowden had no patience for folks who approached the primary material with even so much as a smattering of theory, however one was to understand that. And it very, very conscientiously strove to separate the formation of Blackness and its replication, material replication, literary replication in antiquity, from the racist structures known and read to Snowden himself. It was interesting that Snowden, despite being very knowledgeable about the intellectual history of the study of these artifacts, himself did not invest too much attention into questions of intellectual history. But what was really striking was to see how vociferously he rejected Bernal's arguments, both about the sort of superstructure of this historical interaction that Bernal had posited, but also about the specific context in which classics comes to be as a field, right? This has had, I think, some real implications for how the study of race and ethnicity is conducted in classics. And I think part of the challenge for the sort of a new generation of scholarship will be to reflect on this intellectual history, but not allow it to be a millstone around the neck of the discipline anymore. And this will, among other things, entail resisting the temptation to return to Bernal and his adversaries, or Bernal and Snowden, as a kind of beginning of X, however one is to understand that beginning.
I would hope that you would do that. And if you'd want to do that together, that could be fun.
I'm about it. Sure. Why not?
But I know Frank Snowden like back of my hand, and Snowden he had an ideological stake in finding a place before race.
Mhm.
And so, he invented the Greeks that, never existed. I mean, they were so sublime that their thought was so fine. They were so pure in intellect that, oh my God, that never would occur to them to find a black other in less than equal, et cetera, et cetera. But it very much fits in the ideology of the argument for civil rights for the American Negro. And the lots of intellectual projects that were happening by Black scholars or in what today we would call African American studies that fit into the arguments that would lead up to Brown v. Board and then the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the whole Martin Luther King movement. They needed to find a group of people who were white and who weren't racist. And there was nobody better than Aristotle, Plato, and everybody else. And so he had these glasses on, no matter what he found, he was looking at the evidence through these ideological glasses that were part and parcel of the civil rights movement. And it just drips from every major conclusion that he did. He wasn't value, none of us is, but you can really, all you have to do is pick up a page and think, when was this written? And you can hear Martin Luther King singing, "We Shall Overcome," right? You just can. So I don't know if anyone has looked at the role that classics has played in other ideological struggles, but certainly for the discourse of Blackness and the discourse of race and reason, the discourse of rights, classics has played a major part, even to the point of, as we talked about in a classics faculty meeting recently, with motivating Alexander Crummell to go to the University of Cambridge, right? To refute John C. Calhoun's aspersion that until he found an N-word who had mastered the Greek syntax, quote unquote, he would never believe they really were human beings and fit to, be free. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this is an important point to emphasize, and one that has received a great deal of attention recently in some domains of classical reception. There's been a real care with identifying and elaborating instances of the deployment of classical antiquity understood in a bounded sense, in the overrepresented sense that I've been discussing the past two lectures, in connection with various struggles for liberation. In Anglophone, Francophone context, and Lusophone and Hispanophone context, really throughout the world, especially in the decades after the Second World War, you can find all of these different examples, and scholars are busy within and adjacent to the disciplinary formation of classics, picking up and scrutinizing those examples. The challenge, though, and one that has been on my mind when thinking about folks like Crummell or even Anna Julia Cooper, for example, is that there is a tendency in some of this work to appeal to exemplarity, or to the construction of a new kind of exemplarity, as a form of legitimation for this style of classics as classicism, right? So what I mean by that is that when concern is raised, as it often is, about these historical deployments of the field for profoundly anti-liberal, anti-democratic ends, the rejoinder is, well, we have all of these emancipatory undertakings too, and they vitally depend on scripting the Greco-Roman world in particular ways so as to make that world a springboard for the justification of these emancipatory projects. This gets us, of course, to Snowden, right? Because as you pointed out, and as Snowden himself said very explicitly on more than one occasion, the idea of imagining and documenting this world before race could not be decoupled from the sort of embodied existence in the struggle to advance rights claims on the part of historically minoritized groups. What has concerned me now is that we have not attended to the many ways in which this production of Greco-Roman antiquity and of its interpretation in the hands of these exemplary folk like Crummell participates in the brokering and reproduction of new forms of myth, right? And Crummell is awesome. He also seems like pretty mythic in some ways, right? And especially in how Du Bois imagines him, but also in how he comes to be imagined. There are some ways we could develop for disarticulating these myths from the reality of these contingent circumstances. And I mean, this would entail sort of picking up any one of the examples you named and sort of working through them and thinking with them. What I would say though, is that the challenge that I think will also need to be taken up by scholars in classical reception studies and in other circles of intellectual history is to embrace the possibility that there is an emancipatory work possible or realizable that does not depend on the identification of these superstar figures who manage to show themselves off as capable in their individual persons of fending off the forces of white supremacy and so on.
Crummell, can I have that thing?
You know, everybody discovered Crummell through Du Bois, through the Souls of Black folk, right? Because Du Bois did not bow before any Black person except Crummell. That is the only Black person he gives, and Douglas. That's not true.
Douglas is, yeah.
When Du Bois heard, the night that Du Bois heard that Douglas died, he wrote a poem over and over and over again. I print part of it in the introduction to the Norton Critical Edition of the Souls of Black Folk. And David Blight talks about it in his magnificent biography of Douglas. So that he gave it up for Douglas and he gave it up for Crummell. But Crummell was the man of letters. You know, he had graduated from the University of Cambridge. But when Crummell got to Liberia, man, he just took the structures of white supremacy and just put them on the indigenous, quote unquote, Liberians. He wrote some horrible things about traditional African culture and people. And he was as racist about them as white people were about Black people in general. By the way, Crummell actually is the first person of African descent to matriculate from the University of Cambridge. George Bridgetower got a degree in 1811, but he got a degree just by doing a performance. But Crummell paid his dues. He was in college, failed his first exam, and then passed the second time. And so we've created the Alexander Crummell Prize at Cambridge, which will first be awarded at this coming commencement. And I'm very proud of it.
Wow, that is great news.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's my alma mater.
Ah.
Yeah. Questions, comments? You all got anything to say? If not, we'll keep talking.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you.
We have to let her introduce her, ask the question first. Would you like? Yes, oh, we have, ladies first.
Hopefully a small-ish question, and hopefully one that doesn't force you to start telling us what you're going to talk about tomorrow. I was very struck by what you said about how there was this turn to the language of Greece and Rome for the revolutionary leadership in Haiti. But there's a danger in that, in our concentration on that turn of downplaying originality, and then how you yourself provided us with this fantastic narrative of sort of escaping from, to a certain extent, ideas about classical models. We've also touched on reception studies as a discipline, also in the opening remarks from Abby. Reception studies as a discipline, a sub-discipline that's seen as rightly as one of the most progressive areas of classics. But I was just wondering if you could give some thoughts on how, of course, there is a danger in the very idea of reception studies of downplaying originality, of overrepresenting Greek and Roman models, even in accounts that aim to give voice to marginalized communities. So without maybe giving away too much, have any thoughts on that or how to get past that. Thank you.
I really, really must resist the temptation to disclose what I will discuss tomorrow. But so it would seem that there are a couple of paths forward in taking up and answering your question. One would concern itself with the blinkering effect of classicism, and specifically of the overrepresented kind, and then say, all right, so how do we identify these sort of holes, these myopias, and move strategically around them, right? And this is, you know, especially true, I think, in situations where classicists, in studying these moments of decolonial transformation and upheaval, lapse reflexively into the interpretive mode of saying, oh, this is all about classics. This is real. They, you know, Mandela is really thinking about Antigone. It's kind of a rap. You know, this is how we got to do it, right? It is tempting because it reproduces and promotes the currency of Greco-Roman classics. As Hossam Duhar memorably put it in remarks for the Classical Association a few years ago, it has the effect of promoting this sort of happy face classics, right? But it's also bad intellectual history because, of course, it is not only or even primarily about attachments to Greco-Roman texts and textual practices. And there would, I think, as part of any sort of model of interpretation, one would need to attend not just to the short-sightedness that tends to creep in whenever the Greco-Roman text or Greco-Roman site for praxis is elevated above other sites and formations of praxis. One, I think, also needs to consider how the capital associated with classics and classicism is differentiable from place to place and scene to scene. So in all of these global contexts, there are different significations attaching to classics and classicism. But I have to stress the difference. They're different because in these various circuits, they have material properties that are tangibly and measurably different, in as much as the take-up of particular forms of classicism translates into capital. So this is a roundabout way of beginning to turn in the direction of something that came up yesterday and that will most assuredly come up again tomorrow, which is that the project of imagining futures for forms of classicism that do not insist on overrepresenting themselves has to be materially redistributive in nature. Right. And as part of that work, there would have to be a pretty systematic movement of resources away from institutionalized forms of Greco-Roman classicism. Let me sort of be more concrete in this. Departments throughout the United States and beyond are faced with pretty agonizing questions in places that are not as well-heeled or exhibit such amazing black magic endowment growth as Harvard and Princeton, with the futures of ancient studies, broadly construed. And in these conversations about the future, it's often raised as a phobic specter that criticism of the field of classics in its current form will be sort of cited and mobilized by administrators as a justification for shuttering departments. This came up in conversations about the closure of Howard's department, for example. However, this form of attempting to neutralize criticism of classics, especially of the overrepresented kind, has to be met, I think, with a renewed effort at redistribution of capital, not in playing the zero-sum game of saying, oh my God, we're on the chopping block. We have to protect this property at all costs. We really have to make sure that these other folks don't take it. And for this, I think there are a couple of elevating visions. One can think with can this choose work and the difference aesthetic makes, which I cited yesterday, in defense of a humanities that is actually worth meaningfully defending. But I also think that it would be about time for folks in ancient Mediterranean studies to think about the kinds of coalitions that they will need to broker in order to maintain viable existences in the future. And this is one of the things that I hope the talks sort of in the aggregate model, the need to build coalitions with folks in ethnic studies, and in fact, in the entire constellation of departments that are ushered into being by the social transformations of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. Right. So that I think is a viable path forward and a really desirable and appetizing one as far as I'm concerned. But it would mean surrendering certain claims to institutionalized preeminence. And that's good. I'm about that.
Thank you. So we're going to switch to online and then I will scan the audience for hands. A question came in from Alexander Fort, who I believe you may know.
Yeah.
He says, thanks. I'm going to read the whole question because I don't feel equipped to edit it. So I'll just read the whole thing. Thanks, Danelle. These lectures have been tremendous. I was thinking about your call for a field oriented towards flight, insurgency, and resistance. My question is, for this to happen, what needs to die first? And I think you started to address that. I wonder if Davos could serve as a potential figure for this intellectual and emotional reframing. Specifically, Davos's appearance in your talk by Castellanos yesterday reminded me of Stephanie Russell's favorite joke from Terence's Andrea, wherein this wily slave refuses to solve a problem saying, Davus sum non Oedipus. But what if he were? What if following Rita Dove's The Darker Face of the Earth, or on the model of Toussaint Louverture, the puer did kill paterfamilias, but this time perhaps intentionally, towards transformative change in material conditions, towards a Davine study of the ancient world, what needs to die first?
Oh, I like that so much, Alex, that I'm not even going to attempt to answer it. I think it should just stand as a monument, because I feel that the line of creative reading with and through the materials that the lecturers have put forward, and also the summons of our shared past, since Alex and I went to high school together, and the Stephanie Russell name there is the co-author of the Russell and Keller Latin and Greek textbooks, drafts from which were used to teach me Latin and ancient Greek. Because of our shared past, I will just allow us all to bask in this moment of institutionalized private school privilege that has made so many wonderful things possible in my life. But what I'll add to Alex's point, which I think develops precisely the kinds of readings that I would hope the lectures do engender, is that, yes, well, the paterfamilias must die, the gods must die. You know? The issue at stake for me is, I mean, I'm going to say it again, is material redistribution. So let me take up in more concrete form the circumstances of Alex's and my matriculation into the study of the Greeks and Romans. This was at a school with extraordinary economic resources, although people styled themselves as sort of bohemian wannabes and whatnot. You know, people are all looking broke all the time. But the fact was, we went to a very, very well-heeled private school. This would have to go. Like I'm saying, like if we're talking really about the kinds of material redistribution that would facilitate true epistemic flourishing, the notion that any one institution like a collegiate could exist, or that, or like a Harvard or like a Princeton, could command so much disproportionate share of the world's resources. This would have to end. Like that's where we head. Now, one could say, by way of a counter to this, that the responsibility of phenomenally well-funded and well-endowed institutions like a collegiate or Harvard or Princeton. The peculiar and distinctive property that makes their contribution to epistemic efflorescence worth keeping is that these institutions, by virtue of their resources, can serve as carrier vessels along the lines that I mapped in lecture one. They can serve to incubate and cultivate forms of knowledge production and forms of cultural production that might otherwise disappear for lack of the kinds of institutionalized protection that these institutions can provide. But I don't believe this either. Because if one were genuinely committed to epistemic efflorescence, one would realize that it would be a staple of any egalitarian vision to redistribute resources such that different communities, irrespective of their affiliation or adjacency to an institution like Harvard or Princeton or collegiate, could make the choices for the kinds of practices that they would want to value, promote, cultivate, disseminate, and promote without having to appeal to these institutions and the authority matrices that reside in them. But again, this means that we would have to abdicate all of this in the long run. Now, some people might really, and I think this is a conversation that's come up with some of the folks who I went to high school with, who said, well, in the super long run, yeah, like in the super long run, we can do that stuff in the super long run. I'm talking about right now. Like someone asked me, you know, what I think classics will look like in 20 years. I was like, you know, don't look up because there might not be a world in 20 years. I mean, the task of revolutionary transformation of the discipline is the task for right now. And for all that, the lectures model forms of reading and interpretation that are encased in a set of practices that can be sort of dissected in contexts such as these, right? We are talking about text, we are talking about responses to text and forms of interpretation. I would insist ultimately that the forms of interpretive and intellectual practice writ large that I would want most to inhabit are ones that are committed to as radical a redistribution of resources as possible. And that at the end of the day, this would mean really thinking long and hard about the institutional niches that we all occupy and that make us not just sort of complicit. I mean, this is the adjective that gets used over and over again, but integral to the reproduction of various forms of epistemic hegemony. Right? So that's my consideration of Alex's question, which I did not answer because I think that the premises underlying the question are more important than Alex's figuration of the vision for reading with the lectures, which, while awesome, may direct us a little bit away from the directions that I think are worth most pursuing.
It seems like your shared history gives you the privilege to.
Yeah, you're my boy. We're gonna talk about this later, you know.
So I see that one of our fellows, Céline Larcher, has a question and she has the mic. So thank you.
Yes. Hello, everyone. I am Céline Larcher, one of the fellows of the Hutchins Center this year. Thank you for your very rich presentation, very fascinating. I have a question of curiosity. When I was listening to you, I was wondering in which way the experts of your field were in discussion with an intellectual production on antiquity coming from Africa, and in particular, Francophone Africa. I was thinking about Cheikh Anta Diop or Théophile Obenga, who wrote on Africa in Plateau. So is there a discussion with scholars of your field in the United States and maybe in Europe with this production of knowledge coming from Africa, which would widen the meaning, the very meaning and the very critical understanding of who is classic and what is classicism. And I ask this question because I think that there is a stake in that in terms of including people who are reduced as in minoritized positions in the academia more often. And also this would have also an epistemic stake that would help us in a broader sense to have a more critical appraisal of who is classic and what does classicism mean? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. So an answer in full would do two things that I can only sort of sketch cursorily right now. It would first look at how the knowledge production of African intellectuals and of intellectuals based at African institutions has featured in discussions of Africa in classical studies writ large. And then it would look to the ways in which this incorporation or not incorporation is metonymic or indexical of sort of broader trends in the sort of balkanization and estrangement of different, because minoritized as different practices and histories of cultural production. So on the first, in classical reception studies, there has been a move in recent years headlined by the scholarship of people such as Barbara Goff and Grant Parker to think with the cultural productions of respectively West Africa and in Grant Parker's case, culminating in this marvelous edited volume on South Africa, the southern tip of the continent. Sometimes these projects involve African-based intellectuals, other times they do not. It is instructive and eyebrow-raising to note the instances where this is not, although what's great about Grant Parker's volume is that it does involve folks who are based in South Africa, right? Now there is more and more collaboration between scholars in the Euro-Americas and scholars in African institutions, but there are some interesting ways in which this replicates hegemonic structures that are apparent and that were in fact teed up quite nicely in your question, right? So in the Anglophone Euro-Americas, there is attention to Anglophone African intellectual context. But where's their engagement with, say, the Francophone? The short answer is, well, there isn't a great deal of it, unless you are plugged into circuits of intellectual production that are not Anglophone in nature, that are Francophone already. So if we think of folks who are writing about classics and the history of classical scholarship who are based in France, you might expect to see some indication of this, except you don't. Because, as I was told some time ago by a person, part of whose career has traveled through the ENS, we don't have racism in the highest levels of classics in France. Yes, I was like, I definitely do not believe that. Thank you very much.
That's because they don't have racial categories.
Yeah, exactly. This is like a form.
You can't have racism.
Right. You can mystify it. You can occlude it. You can strategically veil it in this way. So,
But Diop's work is crossed over.
right. So,
Francophone.
right. It took a while. Right. It took a while. And I think often to the organization of these sort of histories of classical scholarship classes that I had to take as part of my training. So first of all, Diop was not on any of these syllabi, right? Diop came into my life later because I was in conversation with folks working on Francophone intellectual production in the post-World War II period, and because I was interested in negritude as a global movement. And eventually people said, you got to read some Diop, you got to start thinking of Diop. The second part of my answer, I'll be very brief in outlining. Recently, there has been real sort of institutionalizing energy devoted to shoring up connections and to the kinds of bridge work that would ideally catalyze and sustain longer term relationships. Like I'm thinking, for example, of the Classics in Ghana conference series that has been launched and that has really, I think, served as a springboard for a new generation of collaborations. I'm also thinking too of one of the ambitions that Sasha May Eccleston and Brown and I had sounded for the Racing the Classics initiative, which is that we would hold at some point in the future, look, the future gaze, at least one conference in Senegal. I mean, this would be very much in alignment with thinking about the place of Senegal specifically, and of Senegalese intellectuals specifically, in cultivating a discourse about classics and classicism in the post-World War II period. But here, I think what will need to be taken up, certainly by colleagues and also by me, is the temptation to approach this kind of exercise as an exercise of identifying and associating with like people. And by that, I mean folks who are in university settings, at university institutions, who are socialized into the rhythms and protocols of the university, who are based within university-centered structures of power, for whom the university as a locus of organization, even as it underwent and continues to undergo decolonization, is still a central ordering principle of their lives. And one of my concerns is with thinking about the various forms of knowledge production that slip through the cracks of this kind of affiliation. Whenever I think about the kinds of folks with whom I'm likeliest to strike up partnerships in research, why is it that I necessarily gravitate towards folks who have appointments at university institutions or who are legible to me as university academics? This has pretty significant implications for forms of knowledge production, actually, because as folks in critical university studies keep reminding us, one of the signature achievements of the post-World War II order was the replication of the Euro-American university as a model for learning throughout the world. This was then subsequently challenged in Africa by 2 generations of academics who sought to implement forms of decolonization that attended to the overriding and overturning of these paradigms that had come in directly with the colonizers. But this is a project that is still ongoing. And what I think is at play in some of the designs for collaboration that I've seen is a habituation into the reassertion of the Euro-American university as the dominant mode of asserting and channeling knowledge production. And that is something I would want to resist, right? I say all of this mindful of how intellectually circumscribed conversations within the field of ancient Mediterranean studies are on this topic. So I don't think that the properties of the field, and crucially its dependence on certain vehicles of university-centered learning, make it particularly well-suited to engage at this level, right? And I think that it is, therefore, on the shoulders of those of us who have some responsibility for things like curricular design to attend to this. But there is only so much of this learning within the university that can take place. Right?
We have one more question. I think, Cilian, I see you have a follow-up, but you can take it up afterwards.
I just had an anecdote. Thank you for your answer. Just about the French translation of Black Athena in Paris at the end of the 90s. I was not at university at this time, but I have the anecdote from Etienne Balibar, the French philosopher. He was one of the who wanted the book to be translated in French. And when the book arrived at the press of La Sorbonne, famous major figures of ancient history made all their efforts so that the books could not be in bookstores in Paris. So the book did not circulate in France, and I have one of the 2 last copies at home in Paris.
Oh my gosh, I would love to see this copy.
I will show you.
That was the subtext of my question, that the response was so out of proportion.
What made Bernal was the critiques of, the demolition job done on it. And that's what I was at. What did he do to drive people so crazy? Because there wasn't this, at the Sorbonne, they wouldn't let Diop, they made him jump through all kinds of hoops to get his degree, but they finally got his degree. President's African published it. It was then translated into English, very much part of the Black Arts movement in the late 60s. I read it as an undergraduate, Yale, 69. And, but Bernal just drove people nuts. So I mean, we can talk about it at dinner. I don't want to waste time, but that is the article I want to see. Why Martin Bernal drove classicists to distraction? You know, what was it so powerful? That shows a lot of power in his text.
Mhm.
The fact that everybody had to line up to kill him. You know, what was that? Why that particular moment? That's what I'm interested in. The hermeneutical moment, you know?
That is a dinner moment question for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, no, because it's beyond anything that he wrote. There was something else that drove people nuts. And they mocked him, you know?
Yeah,
He was a tenured professor of political science at Cornell. He said they couldn't touch him, but they destroyed him in terms of the body of literature, of the classics. One final question. Yes, please. Yes, Professor.
I hope maybe this doesn't prompt. I mean, so I don't want to step on anything that you may be talking about tomorrow, but I wanted to.
The anticipation is
I know, I'm
building.
dying. I'm
It's
really
building.
I can't wait. I wanted to ask about your vision for, as you put it, forms of classicism that do not insist on overrepresenting themselves. And I wanted to think about that through the title for today's lecture, Zealots. You are clearly a person who cares a lot about the words that you use. And so thinking about that title, I thought of the Greek word. It's ultimately a Greek word, and its meaning within the context of the practice of literature and the way it evokes emulation, which is in part the representing of an earlier model, a competitive representing, right? But still a representing. So I guess my question is, you know, is there a form, is overrepresentation built into classicism of any kind? Like, can we really think of a classicism that doesn't seek to overrepresent?
So you will note that among the elective affinities I claimed for Zealots in the opening, I did not name this one. I wonder why, right? So the short answer is probably yes. The long answer is tomorrow. So that's it.
Thank you. See you all tomorrow.
On Zoom.
Oh,
On Zoom